Hi friends, I'm Emma, and I'm a huge book nerd. As you can tell, my space is a little bit of a mess right now because it is almost time for the big move. Just to a new apartment, not to a new city or anything like that. We're so close to the move now that I need to pack up the rest of my books, which means that I need to film my June wrap up. Somehow I have already accidentally packed 2 of these books away, but I'll still tell you about them anyways. But I will show you the rest. I read a total of 8 books in June. Some of them I read physically and some of them I listened to on audiobook. The first one that I read is Educated by Tara Westover. I had tried to read this a couple years ago and just for whatever reason couldn't get into it, but I picked it up again and started reading it again, and this time I really enjoyed it. It's a really fascinating and frustrating story that I think is really important to read. So it's an autobiography by Tara Westover, who was born and raised in Idaho by a family who did not believe in education. She never went to school until she was 17. And she ended up getting into college and working her butt off to learn all of the stuff that she didn't learn up until that point. And it's a really, really fascinating look at the education system and how education is can be really inaccessible, and also how the way you are educated shapes who you are as a person, which is really interesting. I mean, I don't really know how to pitch this book to you. I just think that it's an important story. I think I gave it 4 stars. And then I read The Whisper Man by Alex North. So this book is a thriller, maybe horror, but I think more like mystery thriller, about a man and his son who moved to a town where several years ago there was a series of murders where this murderer would abduct children by whispering outside of their windows. All of that is in the past now. The man is in jail, but our main character's son starts to hear someone whispering outside of his window at night. And it's very spooky. And I liked this a lot, and I gave it 4.5 stars. It's just a really solid, scary mystery thriller, Definitely recommend if you want to be a little spooked. Then, this is one that I've already packed away, but I read The Alienist by Caleb Carr, and it was phenomenal. I really, really loved this. I would describe it as a really richly written historical thriller, which I'm not usually one for historical fiction in general, but the thriller aspect of this got me, which was fun. It's basically about the first criminal profiler, kind of. It takes place in the late 1800s in New York, and there's this serial killer who is murdering a bunch of people, and the police are trying to catch him, and this psychologist gets involved and is I can help you. And he does. And it's very, very dark. It's pretty graphic, but it's really, really richly written. And I loved it. I gave it 4.5 stars. And then this is another one that I packed already, but I read Summer by Ali Smith, which is the 4th book in the seasonal quartet that I have been reading my way through and loving up until this point. I didn't really like Summer, if I'm being completely honest. I think the beautiful poetic language that are in the first 3 just felt like it was kind of missing from this one, and I was less engaged in the characters and the storylines. Yeah, I don't know what to say about it, but I kind of struggled to get through it. I gave it a really sad 2.5 stars. Then I read Beach Read by Emily Henry, and if you have watched my channel for a long time, then you know that I am generally not a romance fan, but I loved this book. I think I loved it so much because the main characters are both writers, and I've discovered that, like, as much as I hate that this is a trope that I like books about writers. This is about a woman whose dad has recently passed away, and she goes to stay at this beach house over the summer to deal with that and some fallout from that. She's also a writer, and she has a deadline coming up. She has to write a book by the end of the summer, but it's just not working for her. She's a romance writer, and she just doesn't feel very hopeful about romance at this point in her life. So she's really struggling with that, and she learns that her next door neighbor is also a writer, but he writes really dark, dramatic fiction. Contemporary fiction. And so they develop a friendship and end up challenging each other to swap writing styles and write a book in each other's style. And, you know, romance ensues, and it's really fun, and it was just the, you know, perfect summer read. I gave it a whopping 5 stars, and I know Emily Henry recently had another book come out, and I haven't been excited about, like, a brand new book in a minute. I've been so focused on, like, what's already on my shelf, but I'm really tempted to pick that up because I think that I would love it. On audiobook, I listened to The Trauma Cleaner: One Woman's Extraordinary Life in the Business of Death, Decay, and Disaster by Sarah Krasnostein. This book is a wild ride. It is not for the faint of heart, I will say. It is about a woman, Sandra Pankhurst, who had a really traumatic childhood and fairly traumatic adulthood as well, who dealt with all of her trauma by becoming a trauma cleaner. I'm sorry, my cat is trying to eat my elbow at the moment. But she becomes a trauma cleaner, and she essentially cleans up other people's trauma. So, like, hoarders, deaths in homes. So, like, if someone dies and their body's not found for a while, suicides, murders, all of that stuff. She does that. She cleans those things up. And so the book is largely about why she does that and how she helps. She not only cleans up the mess, but she helps the people who have created the mess. I mean, obviously not the ones who died, but like the people who are struggling with hoarding, she helps them. The book is about that, and then it's also about her struggles as a trans woman, and the trauma that she experienced because of who she was. And it's a pretty remarkable book. Like, she's a very remarkable woman. Again, the book is not for everyone because it is really graphic. So for sure, like, trigger warning, if you are squeamish, I wouldn't recommend it. But if you are, like, you know, a true crime junkie and that seems intriguing to you, it is really fascinating. So yeah, I ended up giving it 3.5 stars, and I would recommend it. Then I read Girl Interrupted by Susanna Kazin. This is another autobiography. This one is by Susanna Kazin, obviously, who was put into a mental institution in the late 1960s after a 15-minute consultation with a doctor that she'd never met before. He had no prior history. And he spoke to her for 15 minutes and put her in an institution where she stayed for 2 years. So, and she was 18 years old at the time, by the way. So she talks about the whole experience of being there and basically like what that did to her life and what it did to her as a person. It's really interesting. It's also a very short read, so I feel like I don't want to talk about it too much. There is also a movie, which I have not watched yet, but I'm intrigued to watch. Winona Ryder's in it. So yeah, I will watch that at some point. But I definitely think that this was a worthwhile read, and I gave it 4 stars. And then finally, the last book that I read in June was The Virgin Suicides by Jeffrey Eugenides. I don't know how to say his last name, so if someone wants to help me out on that, please do, because I also have Middlesex on my shelf, which he also wrote, which I will read at some point. But The Virgin Suicides is a fascinating novel about these 5 sisters who they're all like between the ages of 15 and 17, I think, maybe 14 and 17. And over the course of this book, they all complete suicide. And the story is told from the perspective of these neighborhood boys who went to school with them and who were fascinated by them and kind of in love with them. And they just sort of had this, they took on this like ethereal role in their community because their parents kept them really like separated from the rest of society. Like they weren't allowed to go on dates ever, and they didn't have a lot of freedom. And so they sort of took on this like angelic, ethereal, otherworldly form to the boys in the town. And then they all die, and it's real sad. It's very tragic, but it's an incredibly like beautifully written book. So I don't know. I mean, obviously, definitely big trigger warning for suicide on this one. The other thing I would say is it definitely romanticizes suicide a little bit, so I would for sure be careful of this book. If that's something that's not going to be difficult for you, then I think that the book is really interesting and the writing is amazing, which is great because I do really want to read Middlesex, which is this author's arguably most famous book, I think because he won the Pulitzer for that book. So anyways, I ended up giving this, I believe, 4 stars, and those are all of the books that I read in June. July is probably going to be a pretty sparse reading month because of the move, but I'll update you at the end of the month and we'll see what I can get through. If you stuck around this far, thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye! Mwah.